G'day everybody, it's Danny here from Botany Danny. I'm a plant hobbyist from Australia, and in this video we're going to be talking about some of my top tips for not killing your plants. Let's get started. The first tip that I have when it comes to not killing your plant is to do the research. Know what sort of plant you've got, know what sort of environment it would normally grow and thrive and live in, and from there decide on which position and best conditions best suit the plant that you've got. For example, is it a rainforest plant that loves water and heaps of shade, or is it more like an Australian native? Or does it have an adaptive mechanism that allows it to store and retain water? Maybe it's a hedge-style plant that loves plenty of sunlight. Or it's a spiky plant that's enough to poke an eye out. It could be an aquatic plant that loves plenty of moisture. Knowing what type of plant you're buying and where it normally thrives and grows is going to be important for ensuring that that plant is going to survive in your care. It also allows you to evaluate whether your home actually is able to cater for the needs of that plant. Just doing a quick Google search, or even asking one of the experts at the local nursery, or even reading the information tag on the plant is enough to give you contextual information about what that plant really needs in order to grow. Think of it as online dating. You're trying to find the perfect match. If you're like me and you often forget what species of plant that you have in your home, did you know that you can take a photo of your plant using your iPhone, and then pressing the information function on that photo, it does a Google search for that plant online, giving you all the necessary plant information right at your fingertips. Tip number 2 is all about working out how much water your plant actually really likes, and it depends on where your plant originates from. If it's a plant that grows by a stream or often grows in water, then it's going to be an aquatic loving plant. Whilst if it's a plant that grows out in the desert or over shrubbery or rocks, then maybe the amount of water that it likes is going to be considerably less. You want to strike the right balance of not overwatering your plant, but also not underwatering your plant as well. The amount of water that each plant is going to prefer is going to really differ greatly. I guess a general rule for watering plants is if your plant has really large leaves, is super green and likes to extend out all over the place, that's probably going to love a lot of water. A couple of things that you can do to try and see if your plant has been watered enough is to do the finger test. That's where you put your finger just at the bottom of the top of the soil and see if it's wet. If it is pretty wet, then I think that indicates that the soil is sufficiently moist and good enough to leave for a couple of days. If the soil is quite dry, then you probably want to top it up and water the plant. Another indication of whether a plant has enough water is by looking at the status of the leaves. If the leaves have a lot of brown tips, then you're probably using water that has too many chemicals in it. Whereas if you see brand new leaves unfurling that are super green and fresh, then it looks like that plant is actually thriving. An important consideration to make is to think about where you're actually getting your water from that you're using to irrigate your plants. If your water comes from a nutrient-rich pond like this, where a lot of the aquatic animals are contributing to the nitrogen-fixing nature of the water, then that's going to probably be a little bit more organic than using, tap water that has a lot of chemicals in it. As you can see in my stream here, which kind of circulates the fish water around and around, these ferns are thriving. They're really absorbing all of the waste created by the fish. And you can tell there's signs of really good growth because all of the tips of these ferns have light green on them. Whenever you see light green, it means there's new leaves coming out, because the amount of chlorophyll in those leaves is relatively low, meaning that it's going to take some time for them to turn dark green and build up the amount of chlorophyll pigment that they have in them. Something that people don't often think about when it comes to watering plants is the type of watering dispenser that you're actually using. Now, a lot of people have watering cans that look like this, where you pour the water in and it all comes out this funnel, which is actually very suitable for potted plants like this, which have a big pot and a big dish underneath, because the volume of water that's going to come out of here is really going to be absorbed into the soil itself. However, not all plants have strong, sturdy leaves. In fact, a lot of plants have really soft, fragile leaves that if you spray them with really hard, high pressured water, it's going to damage the leaves indefinitely. That's why it's important to sometimes use a spray bottle or turn on the spray function on your hose so that you get this cool misting effect, which is less damaging because the pressure of the water is dispersed. Tip number 3 is all about when you buy your indoor plants. So after you've been to the nursery and you've picked out your plants to bring home, please do not throw away the soil that those plants are growing in. A lot of those plants are grown in soil that is nutrient rich, and because the roots have kind of sat comfortably in that soil for such a long time and established itself, if you strip those plants immediately of all that soil and put them in completely different soil, it's going to give that plant a lot of shock, and it probably will be harder for that plant to grow in the long run. If you think about the pot and the soil as being the plant's home, imagine if all of a sudden you had to change homes and move somewhere different without any of your belongings. You'd totally be lost, you'd struggle to kind of survive and get your bearings. The same thing goes for plants. Once they're growing really well in the soil, you want to try and keep as much of that soil as possible. What you want to do is work with the soil that the plant is currently thriving in. If you can kind of transfer that plant into a larger pot, keep as much of that soil as possible. Definitely make sure that the plant is well watered, and then add some potting mix around the periphery of the pot to give it room to grow and slowly establish itself in this new soil. By just adding the plant straight into different potting mix or different soil, that plant is going to really struggle to survive. Fourth tip is all about considering how much light your plant actually needs, and a helpful place to start is actually by reading the label that your plant actually comes in and actually acknowledging and reading the growth conditions quite carefully. Now, just because a label says a plant prefers full shade doesn't mean it prefers no sunlight at all. That plant is still going to need at least 3 hours of good filtered light. If the label says full sun, then that plant is really going to enjoy about 6 hours of non-stop light, and that also on the flip side does not mean intense heated light. It still means indirect light, but light that isn't going to damage the tissue cells of the plants. So when you're deciding where to place the plants that you've just bought, you really want to place it in a spot where the leaves are not going to burn. So you've got to think about, the plant going to survive in this area? So if you're placing it on a windowsill where maybe the light is just shining through that window for 8 hours a day, that plant, unless it's like a hardy, arid, adaptive plant, it's probably not going to survive in that spot. It might be better off placing that plant further away from the window or hanging up higher up where there's more indirect sunlight hitting it. Because the last thing you want to do is burn and destroy something that we spent really good money on. Now, if you're not too sure about whether your plant is happy with the amount of sunlight that's hitting it, an important thing to look at is the way that the leaves are pointed. Are they pointed so that the palm of the leaves are facing directly at the light, or are they kind of pointing in parallel with the light's rays? By just observing the behavior of your plant, you can kind of get an indication of whether it's satisfied with its space or not. Tracing where a plant actually grows and the direction that the leaves are kind of heading towards also gives you a clear idea of where it likes to get its light from. Tip number 5 is all about trimming and propagating. If you see a lot of brown leaves appearing on your plant, you probably want to start trimming them off, because that's a sign that your plant is starting to sacrifice those leaves so that they can invest their energy and redirect it into creating new leaves and new shoots that are more well established. Pruning really helps to promote the growth of new shoots, but also it means that the plant can focus its energy on developing better leaves. Now, if you have a lot of plants at your house and you see that there are plants that have little aerial roots or aerial nodules, that's a sign that your plant might be ready to propagate. Obviously, this depends from species to species, so every plant has its own way of propagating. If you can discover how your plant actually reproduces and how to actually create new versions of that plant with the plant that you already have, they're going to be really rewarded as being a really great plant parent, because you're going to have all these little saplings without the extra cost. Tip number 6 is all about checking your plant's leaves for disease. If you see irregular lines, discoloration, funny spots, things that don't look normal, then it's probably an indication that maybe some sort of fungus or infection is taking over your plant. And so it's important to take off those leaves and discard them. Tip number 7 is, if you see a plant struggling, the worst thing you can do is just leave it sitting in the exact same spot for days and weeks and months on end, where it continues to struggle again and again. Plants don't have legs. All you need to do is pick up the plant and put it somewhere different, and hopefully that new spot that you choose will be better for it. Tip number 8 is looking at the type of container that the plant is growing in. Certain plant pots are more suitable for certain types of plants than others. If it is a terrarium where you're trying to capture a lot of that sunlight and create a humid environment, then a glass style container is going to be particularly good. Ceramic pots like these are particularly porous. That means when you fill them up with water, the water leaches out gradually over time. It kind of goes through really small holes. So what did you think of those 8 tips for not killing your plant? I hope they've definitely helped you get a better insight and idea of how to look after your plants to keep their lives long and healthy. Now, if you've got some really cool plant tips, this is a safe space to share your comments, your ideas and your thoughts. Please definitely write them in the comment section below. I'd love to read them and start a conversation. Otherwise, if you really found this video helpful, please consider liking and subscribing to my channel. It would mean a lot. Otherwise, this is Danny signing out. I'll see you again soon. Goodbye.